In this America, you can survive 2 years at Rikers Island, but nothing prepares you for a rainy July release, clutching a spare key to the Manhattan apartment you bought with your own sweat, only to find the locks changed. My parents' names now sit on the mailbox. They are eating dinner in my living room like victors. They did not just steal 2 years of my freedom with a venomous lie. They wanted to erase my existence entirely. Hello, dear listeners of Maya Revenge Stories, and thank you from the bottom of my heart for tuning in today. Unfortunately, YouTube has completely disabled our channel's monetization, leaving us with absolutely no budget to continue operating and producing the content you love. If you find today's story compelling, please consider supporting us by joining the Maya Revenge Stories Patreon channel, where you can listen to even more incredible, exclusive true stories that are longer, far more detailed, and feature multiple emotional voice actors for scenarios we simply cannot publish publicly on YouTube. You can join our community right now by scanning the QR code on your screen or by clicking the Patreon link down in the video description or the pinned comment. Now, let us begin today's story and meet our main character, Everly Morgan. The heavy steel gates of the correctional facility slammed shut behind me with a sickening thud that vibrated deep in my chest. I stood alone on the wet concrete, under a suffocating slate-gray sky. I had exactly one small plastic bag of personal belongings and a deadweight smartphone, freshly charged to 100%. It was my first morning of freedom, but the air in New York felt heavier than the stale breath of my cell block. 2 years ago, my life was violently derailed. I was sentenced to 24 months in prison for intentional assault, a charge that supposedly led to the tragic miscarriage of my stepsister, Clara. I did not lay a single finger on her. The gavel came down on my life based entirely on the unanimous, tearful perjury of my own flesh and blood. My mother and father stood before a judge, swore on a Bible, and spun a venomous lie that I had pushed Clara down a flight of stairs in a fit of jealous rage. I watched them weep fake tears as they locked their own daughter in a cage. I pulled my thin jacket tight against the biting chill and caught the subway train heading straight into the belly of Brooklyn. The rhythmic screech of the train wheels against the iron tracks matched the pounding in my skull. I was heading to the one sanctuary I had left in this brutal city. It was a high-end luxury apartment, a quiet fortress I had purchased with my own blood. Sweat, and endless 80-hour work weeks as a financial analyst at the Apex Group. It was the only thing my parents could not touch, or so I thought. The lobby of my building smelled exactly as I remembered, a crisp blend of polished marble and expensive white lilies. I rode the elevator up to my floor, my heart hammering against my ribs. I stood before my heavy oak door and reached out to punch my personalized passcode into the digital lock. The keypad flashed a harsh, unforgiving red, access denied. A cold spike of adrenaline shot through my veins. I pressed the numbers again, red. I slammed my fist against the door, the sharp knocks echoing down the empty, sterile hallway. The lock clicked, the door swung open, and the breath was violently knocked out of my lungs. My mother stood in the doorway. She was wrapped in a pristine silk designer robe, her hair perfectly styled, her skin glowing with expensive treatments. She looked down at me, her own flesh and blood, standing shivering in cheap prison-issue clothing. Her eyes were entirely devoid of warmth. She looked at me with the absolute coldness reserved for a stray dog tracking mud onto her immaculate carpet. "What are you doing here?" she hissed, her voice dripping with venom. Before I could even formulate a sentence, my father's booming voice echoed from inside my own living room. He strolled into the entryway holding a steaming mug of artisanal coffee. He did not look surprised. He looked triumphant. "You have no business being here, Everly," my father stated, taking a slow sip of his drink. "This property no longer belongs to you. We took care of the paperwork while you were away. A standard power of attorney, properly notarized, transferring the deed to us. We needed compensation for the emotional trauma you caused this family." The sheer brazen audacity of his words paralyzed me. They had forged a signature, hijacked my assets, and claimed my home while I was rotting in a cell for a crime they invented. They had stolen my freedom, and now they had stolen the very foundation of my life. My mother reached behind the door, picked up a flimsy garbage bag, and tossed it carelessly at my feet. It landed with a pathetic slap on the hardwood floor. "There are some of your old rags in there," my mother sneered. "Now get out of this building before I call the police and report a convicted violent felon for trespassing and harassment." The heavy oak door slammed shut right in my face. The deadbolt clicked into place, sealing them inside my life. I stood there for a long time. The silence of the hallway was deafening. Eventually, I picked up the garbage bag and walked back out into the unforgiving streets of the city. A torrential downpour had just broken over New York, unleashing heavy sheets of freezing rain. I stood on the corner, letting the water soak through my clothes, feeling entirely alone in a metropolis of 8 million strangers. Suddenly, a sharp vibration against my hip broke the trance. I pulled my phone from my damp pocket. The screen lit up in the gloomy darkness with a new text message from an untraceable, unknown number. There was no greeting. There was no name. The message contained nothing but the exact coordinates to a rundown. Late-night diner in the desolate suburban outskirts of Queens. The subway ride out to the deep suburban edges of Queens took exactly 1 hour and 45 minutes. The train car was entirely desolate, vibrating violently as it carried me further away from the glittering skyline of Manhattan. I followed the digital coordinates through a labyrinth of decaying industrial streets until the blurred glow of a flickering neon sign cut through the torrential rain. It was a rundown diner that looked like a forgotten relic from the 1990s, sitting entirely alone beneath a massive concrete overpass. The air inside smelled of burnt coffee and stale grease. There was only one customer sitting in the darkest corner booth, nursing a mug of black coffee with both hands. Even with the heavy beard, the hollowed-out cheekbones, and the worn-out leather jacket, I recognized him immediately. It was Vance, 24 months ago. He was the sharp, aggressive private investigator I had paid a $10,000 retainer to clear my name, 72 hours before my trial began. He vanished without a single trace. I had spent 2 years sitting in a concrete cell, entirely convinced that the man had taken my money and run away like a coward. I slid into the vinyl booth across from him, my wet clothes sticking freezing cold against my skin. I glared at him, waiting for an explanation. "I know exactly what you are thinking, Everly," Vance said, his voice barely a rough whisper. "You think I abandoned you to the wolves. You think I took the cash and caught a flight out of the state." "Did you?" I asked, keeping my voice dangerously level. Vance slowly unbuttoned the collar of his shirt and pulled the fabric aside. A thick, jagged scar ran violently across his collarbone, disappearing down into his chest. "I got too close to the fire," Vance stated flatly. 4 days before your sentencing, someone cut the brake lines on my sedan. I hit a concrete barrier at 70 miles an hour. When I woke up in the intensive care unit, a man in a tailored suit stood over my bed and quietly informed me that if I ever contacted you or looked into the Morgan family again, the next accident would be a fatal bullet to the skull. Your parents did not just frame you. They are hiding a secret so massive, they were entirely willing to murder a private detective to keep it buried. A heavy silence fell over the greasy table. Vance reached into the pocket of his jacket and pulled out a small, encrypted silver flash drive. He pushed it slowly across the formica table until it touched the tips of my freezing fingers. "Before they ran me off the road, I managed to plant hidden audio bugs in your father's home office," Vance explained, leaning in closer. "That drive contains the raw acoustic recordings from the exact night Clara supposedly had her accident on the stairs." I stared down at the small piece of metal. It held the truth that had been denied to me for over 700 days. "What is on it?" I demanded. Vance looked around the empty diner before locking his tired eyes onto mine. "Your parents killed that child. Everly," he said, his words slicing through the air like a razor blade. Clara was pregnant, but the father was a catastrophic nightmare. It was a deeply twisted, incestuous connection, or a scandal so vile that if it ever leaked to the press, it would immediately obliterate your father's seat as the chief executive officer of the Vanguard Charity Fund. He would have lost millions of dollars and every ounce of his social prestige in high society. My stomach violently churned. The pieces were finally snapping together into a grotesque picture. They could not risk a clinic, Vance continued, his tone turning utterly ruthless. They forced Clara to swallow a massive dose of a highly toxic, black-market abortion drug. They wanted to dissolve the problem quietly in their own guest bathroom, but Clara possessed a fragile immune system. Her body reacted violently to the untested chemicals. She began hemorrhaging uncontrollably. She was going into cardiac arrest right there on the expensive Persian rug. I felt the blood drain completely from my face. They panicked, Vance said. If they called an ambulance, the paramedics would find the illegal chemicals in her blood. The police would launch an investigation. They needed a massive, chaotic physical trauma to mask the chemical abortion and give the doctors a reason for the severe internal bleeding. So, they dragged her bleeding body to the bottom of the staircase, called the police, and pointed their fingers squarely at you. They sacrificed your entire life to protect a corporate chair. I gripped the edge of the table. A cold, absolute rage began to replace the despair in my chest. They did not just lie. They had butchered Clara from the inside out and used me as a human shield. "Where is Clara right now?" I asked, my voice completely devoid of any emotion. The media reported that she was sent to a luxury wellness retreat in Switzerland to recover from the trauma. Vance let out a dark, cynical laugh. "That is the final lie, Everly," he replied softly. "Clara never boarded a plane to Europe. She never set foot in a wellness retreat. She is right here in New York. Your parents locked her away in an anonymous, heavily guarded private psychiatric facility in upstate New York. She is not recovering. She is a prisoner, just like you were." I stepped out of the diner and into the relentless, freezing rain of the city. I did not feel the crushing despair that had weighed on me for the past 24 months. Instead, an unnatural, absolute calm washed over my entire body. I was not going to march back to Manhattan and bang on my apartment door like a helpless beggar. I was going to systematically dismantle their entire empire, brick by stolen brick. First, I needed unrestricted eyes on their financial lifeline. I found a cheap prepaid cellular phone at a 24-hour corner bodega and dialed a secure number I had committed to memory during my bleakest nights at Rikers Island. It belonged to a woman known in the underground only as Nyx. She was a brilliant cybersecurity architect who had been locked up for draining a corrupt hedge fund, and we had shared a cramped concrete cell for 8 agonizing months. She owed me a massive favor after I protected her from a violent gang initiation in the recreation yard. "I need a ghost to walk through some highly secure walls," I said the exact second the line clicked open. Nyx did not ask a single unnecessary question. Within exactly 48 hours, she had completely bypassed the military-grade encrypted firewalls of my father's offshore and domestic bank accounts, sitting in a cheap, windowless motel room deep in the Bronx. I watched endless lines of financial data scroll across my glowing laptop screen. The truth staring back at me was far uglier than I could have ever imagined. My parents were completely financially bankrupt. My father had severely mismanaged the Vanguard Charity Fund, creating a catastrophic deficit of over $7 million. To cover his tracks before the board of directors noticed, he had turned to a violent black market credit syndicate. He borrowed $3,500,000 at a predatory, illegal interest rate of 45%. And the collateral he used to secure that illicit loan, the forged deed to my Manhattan apartment, they had not just stolen my home, they had fed it to a pack of ruthless loan sharks to save their own skin, knowing full well that if they defaulted, the syndicate would take the property by force. With their financial motives exposed, I moved to the next phase. Armed with the exact GPS coordinates Vance had provided, I rented a battered sedan using cash and drove 4 hours straight north into a heavily wooded, isolated area in the Catskill Mountains. The private psychiatric facility looked less like a hospital and more like a high-tech fortress built of reinforced concrete and impenetrable tinted glass. Nyx had forged me a flawless digital identity. I was now a registered phlebotomist from a contracted external blood laboratory. wearing a crisp set of blue medical scrubs, a stolen identification badge clipped securely to my chest, and a surgical mask covering half my face. I walked straight through the heavy double-glass doors. My heart slammed violently against my ribs as a massive armed security guard reached out and scanned my barcode. The digital scanner beeped a pleasant, affirmative green. I nodded silently and kept walking, pushing a steel medical cart down the agonizingly long, sterile hallways. The air smelled of strong industrial antiseptic and heavily repressed misery. I memorized the layout of the surveillance cameras, counting the reinforced doors until I reached room number 412 at the absolute dead end of the highest security wing. I swiped the copied magnetic keycard. The heavy steel door clicked and swung inward. The room was completely white, heavily padded, and suffocatingly bare. Clara was huddled in the far corner, clutching her knees tightly to her chest. She looked like a decaying ghost. Her skin was dangerously translucent, and her eyes were sunken hollows of pure, unadulterated terror. When the heavy door shut behind me, she flinched violently, clearly expecting a nurse with a heavy sedative syringe. I reached up and pulled down my surgical mask. "Clara," I whispered softly. I braced myself for her to scream, to hit the emergency panic button, to spew the exact same hatred my parents had weaponized against me. Instead, the exact moment she registered my face, she let out a broken, agonizing sob that seemed to tear her throat apart. She scrambled frantically across the cold linoleum floor and collapsed directly at my feet, grabbing the fabric of my scrubs with violently trembling hands. "Everly, please," she choked out, heavy tears streaming down her pale face. "You have to get me out of this place. They are going to keep me drugged in this room until the day I die. Please, I am so incredibly sorry. I am so sorry for what they did to you." I knelt down, gripping her frail, bony shoulders. "Vance told me everything. I know about the black market drugs. I know about the forced abortion on the living room floor." Clara shook her head frantically, her fingernails digging painfully into my arms. "No, Everly, you do not understand the whole truth. The abortion failed. The toxic drugs just made me hemorrhage. When they dragged me to that underground clinic later that night, they realized the baby was still breathing. The doctor explicitly told them a surgical extraction would kill me on the operating table." I froze entirely, the blood running absolutely cold in my veins. "What exactly are you saying, Clara?" "The baby did not die," she whispered, her voice cracking with absolute, raw despair. "They kept me heavily sedated and hidden in a soundproof basement for 5 entire months until I gave birth. Then, they took my child right out of my arms. They sold the baby to a highly influential politician's family. It was a completely closed, illegal underground adoption in exchange for $2 million in untraceable dark campaign funds and absolute political protection for our father. It was never just about covering up a family scandal. It was a calculated business transaction." The white padded walls of the room seemed to violently spin around me. My parents were not just arrogant liars who framed their eldest daughter to save face. They were ruthless flesh peddlers. They had turned their own newborn grandchild into black market currency and built an impenetrable fortress of lies upon a foundation of human trafficking. A new, terrifying clarity sharpened my mind into a deadly weapon. This was no longer just about taking back my apartment. I was going to burn their entire existence to the ground. Nix fabricated a completely impenetrable corporate background for me, transforming a recently released convict into an elite, high-society philanthropic consultant. Armed with this flawless digital illusion, I secured an invitation to a highly exclusive $5,000 a plate charity gala. The event was hosted by none other than Senator Richard Sterling, a man viewed as the golden boy of American politics. The gala took place at his sprawling, heavily guarded estate in the Hamptons. The Sterling family was the absolute picture of political royalty, and their newly adopted son, a beautiful boy approaching his 2nd birthday, was the centerpiece of their carefully curated public image. I moved silently through the grand ballroom, sipping a glass of expensive champagne, watching the arrogant elite mingle under glittering crystal chandeliers. I needed physical proof to arm my trap. The young child was playing near the massive garden terrace, supervised by a uniformed nanny. I waited with the absolute patience of a predator. When the boy spilled a small amount of juice on his chin, the nanny wiped his mouth with a pristine white cloth napkin and casually tossed it onto a silver clearing tray held by a passing waiter. I smoothly intercepted the waiter near the kitchen entrance, palming the discarded napkin before slipping out the service doors. Within exactly 48 hours, an independent, highly discreet medical laboratory returned the results. The truth was printed in stark black ink. The genetic match to Clara was a flawless 99.9%. The child was undeniably a Morgan grandchild. I did not run to the press or the federal authorities. A sudden public explosion would give my parents and the senator a chance to spin the narrative, hire aggressive public relations firms, and play the victims of a complex extortion scheme. I needed them to tear each other to pieces in the dark. I compiled a thick, unmarked leather binder. It contained the certified DNA report, heavily encrypted financial trails tracing the dark money campaign contributions back to my father, and a single, meticulously typed letter. I wrote the letter from the perspective of an anonymous blackmailer. I warned the senator that the Morgan family was actively using his adopted child as a lethal insurance policy, a ticking time bomb meant to extort him out of millions of dollars when his upcoming re-election campaign began. I had a specialized courier deliver the package directly to his private office desk in Washington. Paranoia is a highly lethal poison, especially among powerful men who have everything to lose. To protect his pristine political career, Senator Sterling did not just cut ties with my father, he cornered him like a wounded animal. Through the hidden audio bugs Vance had originally planted in my father's office, I listened to the frantic, late-night phone call. The senator ruthlessly demanded that my father hand over every single original medical document, the forged birth certificates, and all physical evidence of the underground transaction within 72 hours. If my father failed to comply, the senator threatened to personally leverage his political power to see the entire Morgan family buried in a maximum security federal penitentiary. My parents realized they were completely trapped. Their most powerful, untouchable ally had instantly transformed into their executioner. The Vanguard Charity Fund was already bleeding dry from my father's previous embezzlement, and now they needed a massive injection of untraceable cash to fund a permanent, immediate escape from the United States. I listened to my mother weeping hysterically in the background, her carefully crafted high society facade shattering into a million jagged pieces. They began frantically attempting to liquidate everything they owned, but the violent loan sharks were still holding the forged deed to my apartment, aggressively demanding the repayment of their $3,500,000, plus the exorbitant 45% interest rate. My parents could not legally list my Manhattan apartment on the open real estate market without triggering a massive federal audit of their stolen, frozen assets. Driven entirely by blind panic, they were forced to list the property on a deeply hidden, underground broker network for an immediate, no-questions-asked cash liquidation. They were terrified, running out of options, and rapidly running out of time. This was the exact moment I struck. I hired an aggressive, completely anonymous offshore corporate attorney to represent a fictitious shell company based in the Cayman Islands. Through this invisible proxy, I submitted a brutally low, all-cash offer for my own home. I offered them exactly $1,200,000. It was an insulting fraction of the property's actual market value, but it was just enough money to pay off a small portion of their violent creditors and buy 2 one-way first-class tickets to a country without an extradition treaty. Desperation makes arrogant people completely blind. Less than 3 hours after the offer was submitted, my father signed the digital transfer papers. He practically gave my sanctuary back to me, completely unaware that the invisible noose tightening around his neck was being held by the very daughter he had thrown away. Exactly 11 o'clock at night marked the eve of their supposed escape and the finalization of the property transaction. My parents were frantically packing their remaining designer clothes in the middle of my living room, They truly believed they had outmaneuvered the political sharks and the violent syndicates. They thought they were merely hours away from a first-class flight to permanent freedom. That was the exact moment I pressed the send button on my encrypted mobile device. A short, high-definition video file arrived simultaneously on both of their cell phones. The footage was incredibly simple, but utterly devastating. It showed Clara sitting comfortably in what appeared to be a brightly lit New York Police Department interrogation room. She was holding a warm cup of coffee, speaking calmly to a detective sitting just off camera. It was a completely fabricated environment. Nix and Vance had rented an abandoned warehouse deep in Brooklyn, dressing a hired actor as a police officer and using basic theatrical lighting to create a flawless, terrifying illusion. But to my parents, who were already suffocating under the crushing weight of their own paranoia, it was the ultimate death sentence. I sat in my dark motel room, staring blankly at my laptop screen, watching their immediate reaction broadcast live. They were entirely unaware that 48 hours prior, Vance had disguised himself as a building maintenance worker, bypassed the lobby security, and entered my apartment under the guise of repairing the ventilation system. He had meticulously planted high-definition, micro-surveillance cameras inside every single air duct in the ceiling. Through the hidden audio feed, I heard my mother let out a blood-curdling, hysterical scream. She dropped her phone onto the hardwood floor. Her perfectly manicured hands clawed violently at her own hair. The pristine, high-society mask completely dissolved in a matter of seconds, revealing the terrified, wretched creature hiding underneath. "She is at the police station," my mother shrieked, her voice echoing sharply off the expensive walls of my home. "Clara is with the federal authorities. She is telling them absolutely everything: the black market chemicals, the underground clinic, the massive transaction." My father's face turned the color of wet, dead ash. He lunged forward, grabbing her roughly by the shoulders, shaking her violently. "Shut your mouth right now," he roared, his voice trembling with unchecked, desperate rage. "Keep your voice down before the neighbors hear you." "We are completely finished," she screamed back, violently pushing him away. She stumbled backward, knocking over an expensive crystal vase that shattered explosively across the floor. "This is entirely your fault. It was your brilliant, twisted idea to sell the newborn baby to the Sterling family. It was your idea to point the finger at Everly and let her rot in a concrete prison cell for 2 entire years just so you could keep your pathetic position at the charity fund." "I did what I had to do to protect our wealth," my father bellowed, his face contorted into a mask of pure, vicious cruelty. Both of those girls were nothing but useless liabilities. Clara was a pathetic, weak-minded fool, and Everly was a self-righteous brat. I sacrificed them because they were entirely expendable. We traded a useless infant for $2 million in political protection. They tore into each other like starving, cornered wolves. They physically shoved and slapped one another amidst their half-packed luxury luggage. Every single vile motive, every ounce of their profound contempt for their own flesh and blood, and every explicit, ugly detail of their heinous crimes was screamed out loud in the dead center of the room. They had absolutely no idea that their violent, ugly confession was not just being recorded, it was currently being broadcast live. Nix had successfully hijacked the internal communications server of the Vanguard Charity Fund. She flawlessly routed the encrypted, anonymous video feed directly to the private email inboxes and secure mobile devices of every single board member, major shareholder, and wealthy corporate sponsor associated with my father. The fallout was beautifully catastrophic. Within exactly 2 hours, the corporate guillotine swung down. My father's phone began ringing incessantly. Urgent, furious messages flooded his screen. The board of directors held an emergency midnight vote and officially terminated him with immediate effect. Less than 20 minutes later, tipped off by the terrified and furious shareholders, the United States federal government issued a total, unyielding asset freeze on all of my parents' banking accounts due to immediate suspicion of massive corporate embezzlement and international money laundering. My father stared blankly at his banking application, watching his multi-million-dollar balances plummet instantly to absolute zero. The realization hit them like a physical blow to the skull. They were completely bankrupt, universally exposed, and actively hunted. Driven completely mad by blind panic, they abandoned their heavy luggage. My mother frantically scooped up whatever loose diamond jewelry and expensive watches she could fit into her leather designer handbag. They sprinted out of my apartment, took the elevator down to the underground parking garage, and jumped into their sleek black luxury sports utility vehicle. They tore out into the wet midnight streets of New York, desperately speeding toward John F. Kennedy International Airport to catch any departing international flight. They never even made it out of the borough. As their vehicle approached the brightly lit toll booths at the exit of the Midtown Tunnel, 6 unmarked Federal Interceptor vehicles swarmed them from all directions. The deafening wail of police sirens shattered the quiet night. Heavily armed tactical officers dragged my parents out of their luxury vehicle, throwing them violently against the cold, wet asphalt. My parents screamed that they were being illegally detained, entirely convinced this was a federal sting regarding the child trafficking or the charity fraud. But as the officers popped the trunk of their vehicle, the real trap was finally sprung. They were not stopped for what they did to Clara. They were violently pulled over because an anonymous informant had reported a massive shipment of illegal, untraceable federal narcotics entirely hidden inside the spare tire compartment of their car. It was a heavy parting gift, quietly planted by Vance just hours before their attempted escape. The sterile, fluorescent lights of the federal interrogation room buzzed with a low, agonizing hum. My parents sat handcuffed to the heavy steel table, their designer clothing wrinkled and stained with the dirty rainwater of the city streets. Even with their entire world collapsing, they maintained a sickening aura of absolute arrogance. Through the one-way observation glass, I watched my father demand his expensive defense attorneys, completely confident that he could simply buy his way out of a minor drug possession and a financial misunderstanding. He had absolutely no idea that the ground beneath his feet had already disintegrated. The heavy metal door clicked open. My parents expectantly looked up, likely waiting for a high-paid corporate lawyer to walk through the frame. Instead, the color violently drained from their faces as I stepped into the freezing room. I was not alone. Flanking me were 2 senior agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and walking right beside me was the chief counsel of the Apex Group, my former employer. "What is this?" my father hissed, rattling his heavy steel handcuffs. "Get her out of here. I have absolutely nothing to say to this convicted criminal." I pulled out a metal chair and sat down directly across from them. I placed a thick black folder onto the table. "You are not talking to a criminal anymore," I said, my voice dangerously calm. "You are looking at the person who just handed the federal government the final piece of your absolute destruction. But before they lock you away, we are going to talk about the real reason I spent 2 years in a concrete cell." The chief counsel stepped forward, unbuttoning his suit jacket. "The Apex Group conducted a massive internal forensic audit of your Vanguard charity fund over the past 48 hours, directly tracing the dark money you funneled to Senator Sterling. We found the ghost accounts, and we found the communication logs." My parents froze completely. "I know the ultimate truth now," I continued, leaning closer so they could see the absolute zero in my eyes. "That baby was never Clara's biological child. Clara was nothing but a terrified, captive surrogate for a massive, deeply illegal underground transaction. Senator Sterling needed an untraceable child for his political image, and you provided the womb to secure his absolute protection." My mother began to violently tremble, her breath catching in her throat. "But you got incredibly greedy," I stated, the puzzle pieces finally locking together for them to see. "You realize that as a financial analyst at Apex, I was getting dangerously close to uncovering the dark money trails connecting Vanguard to the senator. So, the senator ordered you to silence me. He orchestrated the entire frame-up to put me in a maximum security prison and completely destroy my credibility. But instead of just following his orders, you kept the physical evidence of the surrogacy and the dark money. You actively used it to counter-blackmail a United States senator to fund your pathetic, lavish lifestyle." My father's arrogant posture completely shattered. He looked like a hollowed-out, pathetic old man. The federal narcotics in the trunk of your vehicle carry a mandatory minimum sentence of 25 years, the lead federal agent stated, his voice devoid of any sympathy. But we are offering you a one-time opportunity. Hand over the original blackmail files, the forged birth certificates, and testify against Senator Sterling regarding the human trafficking ring. In exchange, we drop the narcotics charge. Driven completely by their own selfish cowardice and the desperate need to save their own skin. My parents eagerly took the bait. They threw the senator under the bus, signing complete, legally binding confessions and handing over the exact keys to their own kingdom. They thought they were buying a lighter sentence. They were entirely wrong. By voluntarily handing over the absolute proof of their collusion, they confessed to crimes far worse than the planted drugs. I had used their own boundless greed to turn them into sacrificial pawns. The immediate aftermath was swift and merciless. Within 24 hours, the hidden audio recordings from the night of the fake miscarriage and Clara's agonizing written testimony were officially released to a federal judge. My conviction was completely overturned. The judge struck the gavel, expunging my criminal record and immediately restoring my honor and my freedom right there on the courtroom floor. As for my parents, the federal prosecutors showed absolutely no mercy, without the protection of the senator, who was arrested by federal agents in his Washington office that exact same morning. My parents were utterly defenseless. They were convicted on a mountain of federal charges, including aggravated forgery, massive financial fraud, and complicity in organized human trafficking. They were sentenced to spend the remainder of their natural lives in a maximum security federal penitentiary, with absolutely no possibility of parole. The very next morning, the sun broke through the heavy New York clouds. I stood in the exact center of my high-rise apartment in Brooklyn. I had hired a professional biohazard and removal crew to throw away every single piece of furniture, every rug, and every pathetic trace of my parents' existence. I paid an expensive contracting team to paint the walls a pure, brilliant white. I stood by the massive glass window, looking down at the glittering, chaotic streets of the city I had finally conquered. I held the cold, heavy metal key to my apartment tightly in the palm of my hand. A deep, profound sense of peace washed over my entire soul. I smiled, realizing that the most perfect absolute revenge does not require spilling a single drop of blood. True revenge is completely reclaiming your own life, taking back your power, and letting the monsters rot forever inside the 4 concrete walls they built with their own hands. Thank you so much, from the bottom of my heart, for listening to the very end of this story. Where in the world are you tuning in from today? Please let me know down in the comments section. If you truly enjoyed today's story and want to help us keep the channel alive, please consider joining the Maya Revenge Stories Patreon channel. Over there, you can listen to our absolute best, highly exclusive true stories that we simply cannot publish publicly on YouTube. You can join us right now by scanning the QR code on your screen, or by clicking the Patreon link in the description box or the pinned comment below. Thank you for your incredible support, and I will see you all in the next video.